Every night, the golden halls of the palace shook with the piercing cries of the prince's newborn heirs, their tiny bodies writhing in silken cradles that offered no comfort. Servants scurried helplessly under the stern eye of the governess, her voice cold and cruel, condemning their failure with a single glance. The prince, cloaked in grief, lingered at the threshold, powerless to soothe the children left motherless by tragedy. Only the youngest maid, poor and unseen, dared to stay when others fled, her heart breaking with every desperate wail. And one night, she crossed a forbidden line, setting in motion a twist that would defy the palace itself. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Night gathered over the palace like a velvet shroud, muting the world to breath and echo. In the nursery, the quiet never held. Two thin voices shredded the hush, raw and insistent, rising and falling in jagged waves that shook the painted ceiling and rattled the glass in the tall windows. The lamp on the sideboard trembled with each draught, its small flame catching on brass and crystal, making a scattered crown of light across the room. Silk curtains hung heavy, embroidered with lilies that could not soften the sound. Every gilt edge and polished surface reflected luxury, and none of it mattered. The children cried. She stood with one child in each arm, head bent, hair slipping from its pins. The little bodies were light as fledglings, but grief made them heavy in her hold. 3 months old, and grief had a way of showing even in their fists. The new maid knew enough that the other servants still called her girl instead of her name, shifted her weight and tried to pace a slow figure 8 on the carpet. The twins' cheeks were hot against her forearms. She adjusted them, one cheek tucked against her shoulder, one cradled near her collarbone, and tried a rhythm that matched the lamp's faint flicker. "Come now," she whispered, breath catching. "Come, sweetling, come." She counted under her breath, not to measure time, but to keep her heart from racing. The clock in the corner marked minutes with a soft click. The clock had not slept in weeks. Neither had anyone else who crossed the threshold of this room and tried to be more than furniture. A young attendant hovered near the door, wringing his hands. "Shall I fetch the wet nurse?" he asked, voice pitched low, as if loudness could break something already broken. "She has tried," the maid said, eyes never leaving the infant's damp lashes. She changed her hold. The one on her left hiccuped, which in other children might mean surrender. Not these. They seemed to startle at their own silence, then storm it again with wails. The attendant shifted. "The physician, then?" "The physician cannot make them a mother," she murmured, and the words seemed to hang heavy as the curtains, a truth no one wanted in the air. She swallowed them back. "Bring hot water," she added, more practical, "and warm the linen. That, at least." He left, shoes whispering across carpet to stone, the door closing without latch. The maid breathed and counted and moved. She tried the lullaby her own grandmother had used, a tune without a name that turned on itself like a circle of hands. The melody carved a small path through the noise, but the twins did not recognize it yet. They arched and cried against her. She looked at the cradles lined with lace, the tiny pillows with their hand-stitched cases, and felt the uselessness of ornament. She had been told to keep her distance, told that a maid's hands were for washing and folding and lighting lamps, not for holding royal airs against her heart. They had brought her to this room 3 nights ago with instructions and a warning. She had listened. She had nodded. And then the night had turned. And the children had cried with such force that the warnings felt like ceremony detached from breath. She had not asked permission to lift them. She had done it, and the world had not ended, except in the way it had ended already. The lamp guttered, flickered back. The maid crossed to the fireplace with both infants wrapped close and nudged a coal with the toe of her shoe, coaxing the heat to rise. She had watched another servant try to lay them down after a feeding. The moment their bodies met linen, they had cried so hard they frightened themselves. Now their cries rasped the air raw. She tried a shushing breath, long and steady, so they could match her. She let one hand trace a slow circle between tiny shoulder blades. She let her shoulders loosen. Children could feel tension, as if it were a draft. In the corridor, feet moved. Voices passed and faded. The palace at night was a living thing, quiet in the way the human body is quiet. 1,000 small sounds that mean life. The maid heard them all and felt very alone in the middle of them. "Shall I take one?" Another maid, older, had slipped in, apron crinkled from washing, eyes tired but kind. The new maid shook her head. If she divided them, one would wail harder, the other would follow, and the sound would double back on itself. "Warm linen, if you please," she said instead, softness and steel in equal parts, and the cloth for their brows. The older maid nodded and moved with the authority of someone who knew where everything was kept. The table by the window cleared of a silver rattle and a tiny comb. The warmed cloth came, and the new maid pressed it lightly to each child's temple, then to their hands, then to the bottoms of their feet. The shock of heat made them gasp, then cry with a different pitch. She listened, trying to map their need. The one on her left cried with a thinner sound, the one on her right with a rougher, chest-deep sob. She shifted again, bringing the thinner voice closer to her body. "Forgive me," she whispered, into a soft plume of hair. "Forgive the world." The words were a habit, more than a petition. She did not believe the world knew how to answer. Footsteps approached in the corridor, the even, measured sound of a gentleman's boot. The older maid went still, then glanced toward the door as if it might be her fault the world had come to stand outside it. The new maid's stomach tightened. She kept moving. She was not supposed to be the first sight at the door, arms full of the heirs. She should be in the background, ready at the edges. She had seen him only from a distance, a figure of black and silver, a profile in a portrait that had been painted too quickly. When he had passed through rooms, people had stilled as if he were weather. The first time she heard him in the corridor outside the nursery, he had not come in. He had stood, and the servants had arranged themselves around the absence of his presence. The night had continued. Now the footsteps slowed, paused. The new maid did not look up. She did not have eyes to spare. The older maid smoothed her apron and did not dare announce anything. The door remained open a fraction, a breath. The infant's cries sharpened and softened, shifted. The new maid let the thin-voiced child ride higher on her shoulder and used the side of her face to make a small cocoon of warmth. She felt the tiny ribs against her jaw. The other child's breath came in hiccups. She matched the pace. "Girl," the older maid said under her breath, without scold, only warning, only fear. "Mind yourself." "I am minding them," the new maid answered, just as low. The words were insubordinate only if you counted rules and not tears. She counted tears. The attendant returned with a basin, steam rising like a ghost. He set it down with care and avoided the open space, as if invisible lines had been drawn in chalk, and he dared not cross them. The steam warmed the air. The lamp steadied. The new maid eased toward the table, careful not to jostle small arms. She dipped the cloth again, wrung it, pressed it softly against a small forehead. The child gasped, and for one heartbeat, silence cut the air clean. It was thin and brave and went away. The crying started again, softer. In the corridor, the measured boots turned away. The new maid did not know whether to feel relief or abandonment. She did not name either feeling. She kept moving. Minutes passed in the way that minutes do when each one has its own weather. The new maid's arms ached, her back ached, her eyes stung, the children cried. A small sound at the window made her lift her head, the wind pressing its palm against the pane. For a moment the world outside the palace made itself known. The city's dull hush, the river a dark line, the hills beyond holding their own silence like bowls. Inside, the nursery kept to its own geography, the lamp a sun, the fireplace a low horizon, The cradles a pair of islands no one could land on. The older maid returned to the laundry, the attendant hovered, and the new maid walked and breathed and hummed until her own throat had gone dry. She glanced at the pitcher and thought of water and did not dare ask for it. The twins quieted by degrees, not because of the tune, but because of the endurance of motion. And then, as if offended by the hint of calm, they cried again. "Tell me what you want," she said, and the words were absurd and necessary. "Tell me, and I will do it." One of them rooted, mouth searching, even though they had been fed less than an hour ago. The instinct was as old as breath, and it made the maid's chest ache with a kind of helpless compassion she did not know how to bear. She shifted them again, made herself a shelter of bones and cloth and warmth. At the door, the attendant whispered, "He's still outside." The new maid did not look. The knowledge ran down her spine like cold water. "He should not be," she said. It was not for her to say where princes ought to stand. But she said it, because the corridor was a place for ministers and condolences, and the nursery was a place for breath and skin. The words were treacherous, even to herself. A coal settled in the grate, sending up a soft sigh of sparks that did not break the lamplight's hold on the room. The maid traced the circle again and again, the weight of the infants shifting in her arms as they grew heavier with exhaustion, then lighter with sudden flailings. The older maid returned with a small cushion and slid it toward the cot in the corner, the narrow bed reserved for attendants who spent the whole night on duty. The new maid glanced at it, and then away. The cushion looked indecently soft, given the circumstances. The footman at the door, he had the look of someone too young to hold so much protocol in his spine, cleared his throat. "If you need to rest," he started, then faltered, because the offer itself was against everything he had been taught to say in a room like this. "If I stop," she answered, voice level, "they will not." The sentence settled like a pact in the air, and in that moment, it felt truer than anything else the palace could decree. The attendant nodded as if he understood. He took up the basin and emptied it discreetly into a pail, then brought fresh hot water. The routine of it made a small circle of order in the night's disorder. The maid let herself hold to that. She dipped the cloth, wrung, pressed, rocked, hummed. The lamp burned lower and had to be turned up. The clock ticked. At the edge of the broad woven rug, the maid's foot caught on a thread that had worked loose. She saved her balance with a quick shift of weight, clutching the twins close, and for a breath the crying paused, replaced by the startled silence that follows the near drop of any fragile thing. That silence was a revelation. It meant stillness lived somewhere inside the storm. She exhaled through her mouth, a slow sound, and the thin-voiced child sighed. The other's breath caught and steadied. The new maid felt her own lungs unclench. "Once more," she promised, to them or to herself. Once more. The corridor quieted, the footfalls diminishing. The prince's presence felt further away. It eased a pressure she did not name. It disappointed something too, and she did not name that either. She focused on the tiny breaths, on the heat of two small foreheads, on the damp curls against her skin. The nursery had narrowed to that. Time passed in a straight line, long as the hallway outside, measured by the clock and by the small voices that refused to be soothed all at once. The new maid watched the lamp flame and whispered the names of objects to the children as if naming could tame the world. Chair, light, cloth, hand. She did not say father. She did not say mother. She said room to remind them, perhaps, that they were held by something. She could feel the tremor of her own muscles like a drumbeat in her arms. She shifted to keep from numbing one hand completely. The attendant saw and nudged a stool closer with his foot, careful not to scrape it on the floor. She did not sit. The motion mattered. She moved, and their small bodies loosened, and the sound of their cries frayed at the edges. When the lamp flared once and quieted, she decided to try the cradles again. She drifted to the nearest, the carved wood smooth under her fingers, the little pillow daring any head to rest on it. She lowered the child with the thinner cry first, inch by inch, letting fabric accept weight before the body did. For a heartbeat, the infant allowed it, lashes fluttering like moth wings. The instant the small head touched linen, the cry ripped loose again, wider than before, and the other child answered, as if called. The maid lifted them both back up, her own breath breaking. The cradles stood reproached, useless islands. The attendant flinched, then stood straighter. "We could—" He trailed off, searching for a solution that would not break rules in half. "We could ask if—" "We will not ask," she said. "We will do." Then, softer, because the edge had been for herself as much as for him. "Please mind the door." He took his position just inside, a guard against drafts and eyes alike. The corridor beyond had gone quieter. The footman there moved only to keep his blood from freezing in his veins. The new maid felt the shift and glanced up. The door was still ajar by a breath. She moved closer to the cot in the corner, not to rest, but to find a different sort of movement. She sat, finally, but only to let the motion change. A new rhythm, a new angle, a new chance. She kept the twins tight against her, their bodies forming a single warm line across her lap, their small faces turned toward one another as if they might recognize their own reflection in the other's cheeks. The cot dipped under her. It was a scandal to sit with them, but she had already committed her hands to scandal. The room made its small noises, a coal settling, a cloth sinking back into water, the clock counting the single steps of time, and over it all, the cries softened into wet, weary sounds that could be answered. The maid kept her body a cradle and listened. Each change in the cry had its own meaning. She learned it. She answered it. "Sleep," she told them, a command and a blessing. "Sleep now." As if in defiance, the thin-voiced child gave one last, high cry, and then folded into a sigh that was almost a sob. The other's breath hitched twice, then settled. The room did not recognize the sound at first, the sudden lack of demand. The air leaned in, waiting to be torn again. The lamp's flame steadied. The maid's breath came out in a soft, incredulous rush. She dared not move. The twins lay heavy and warm. The stubborn set of their mouths loosened into something soft and human. The space around them expanded to hold the quiet. The attendant blinked as if waking. He took one step toward the door and stopped, hand lifted. The corridor beyond held its own breath. The palace, held taut for so long, loosened by a hair. "Hold," the older maid whispered, appearing with a fresh cloth, then stopping short, eyes going wide as she took in the sight. "Hold," she said again, softer. She set the cloth down as if it was sacred. She backed away without turning, as if any sudden movement would shatter the thin glass of hush. The new maid did not dare move more than the next breath. She let her head rest against the wall for one moment and felt the strength of it against her skull. She felt the children's breath against her wrists like tide. She sat and counted heartbeats, hers and theirs, as if numbers could anchor a miracle. In the corridor, the measured tread returned. Slower now, as if the walker was listening hard. The attendant stepped to the threshold and paused, head turned slightly, waiting for a cue that could not be given in words. The new maid looked down at the twins and felt a warmth spread through her chest that was not pride, not relief, something more dangerous than both. The footsteps stopped outside the door. The new maid's mouth went dry. She did not lift her head. She did not have to. The air announced his presence in the way all rooms do when power enters them, temperature shifting by a degree, light finding new angles to catch. The attendant glanced back at her. She nodded once. She tightened her hold for the smallest of seconds, then loosened, for calm had to be honest. The door moved without a sound. A line of cooler corridor air slipped into the room and met the lamplight halfway. The attendant stood aside. The new maid did not stand. She could not without waking the world. Boot leather creaked the smallest fraction against wood. He came in far enough to be part of the lamp's circle. The new maid kept her eyes on the small, relaxed faces on her lap. The twins' breath went in and out, in and out. The room listened. The clock counted. He took another step, slow, measured, the sound almost nothing. The maid's heart hammered against her blouse. She told herself he would be angry. She told herself that anger was a cold thing, and that she could be colder. She told herself what she had done was nothing but care, and that care did not need apology. The words were a litany, and even as she said them inside her head, something else, something wordless, lifted its face. Behind him, the corridor closed out of sight. The world narrowed to lamp and breath and the nearest threshold. He stopped. Her hands did not shake. Her arms did not lower. The twins sighed in their sleep as if the door's movement had been a lullaby. The maid was not sure whether to be grateful or afraid. The quiet pressed against her eardrums until it felt like a weight. He did not speak. When he breathed, it was a soft sound, barely more than the exhale of the lamp. She knew, without turning her head, that he was closer than the brass bowl, closer than the fire, close enough that if she lifted her eyes, she would find a face that had been carved by loss and duty into something no one could read unless they were standing where she was. She stared instead at the smooth curve of a small ear. She watched a tiny hand flex, then relax. She looked for courage and found only the need to keep still. He moved one more pace. The floor answered. The lamp flame leaned and righted itself. The new maid felt the air change, as if the room itself had drawn a breath with them. She told herself not to hope, not to fear, not to think beyond the next inhale. On the other side of the cradle, the night pressed its face to the window, curious. Somewhere far away, a clock in another corridor chimed the quarter hour, 4 soft notes that died almost as they were born. He reached the edge of the lamp's glow and looked down. He froze on the threshold of the light, breath stilled, because in the quieted nursery lay a sight no rule had prepared him to face. He took in the room as if it were a battlefield he had been avoiding for too long. The lamp made a small circle of gold on the walls. Within it, the cot in the corner had become an island. On that narrow bed lay the maid he had seen earlier, her head turned toward the wall, hair loosened from its pins. Between her arms, nestled against the plain folds of her gown, the twins slept. Their faces were unknotted at last. Their mouths were soft. Their breathing made a sound like paper sliding over paper. One small hand lay open over the other's shoulder, as if they had reached in sleep for what waking never granted. Everything he knew fell into 2 columns, what was permitted and what was not. This belonged unmistakably to the second column. His first impulse rose, sharp and instinctive, to cut the scene in half with a command, to separate bodies that should not touch. Every lesson drilled into him about the invisible lines of rank, the ways those lines protect what words cannot, pulled him toward the word no. But the room smelled of lamp oil and warmed linen and something tender he had not breathed in months, the quiet of children at rest. He felt the word hesitate in his throat and hold there, suddenly heavy. He took 1 step closer. The boards did not complain. He did not take the second step for several heartbeats, as if his body were testing what the first had changed. He had not yet heard their silence, not like this. He had heard them exhausted into quiet, brief and brittle. He had heard them gulp air between sobs. He had heard the lull of a feeding and the shudder of waking cries. This was different. Their breaths rose and fell together. The sound remade the air of the nursery, making it habitable. His hands curled at his sides, then smoothed the front of his coat, as if he could press his outrage back into place with good tailoring. He thought of the rules. He thought of the pictures people hold in their minds when they think of a household like this one. Order, distance, serenity purchased by obedience. The rules kept those pictures from smearing. Yet the rules did not change the shape of the small faces before him. He could not see the maid's eyes. He saw the curve of her cheek and the line of her throat, the way sleep had softened the strain he had seen earlier. She had wrapped her arms in a half-circle around the twins without enclosing them, a shape that suggested permission rather than possession. It was a servant's body making a shelter none of the room's expensive objects could provide. His breath sharpened. He knew the cost of tenderness when it crossed lines. He knew the way a reputation could take a stain from a single unsanctioned gesture, the way a household could falter from a single rumor fed with confidence. This was the sort of scene that grew teeth in retelling. He could already hear the cadence of reproach, the sentences that would be spoken just outside his hearing. Impropriety, presumption, unbecoming. He set his jaw. "Wake," he said softly, almost a breath, almost not a word. He did not want to wake the infants. He wanted the person whose choices had made this moment to know he had witnessed it. Her lashes fluttered before her eyes opened. The change was small and complete. In an instant she was awake enough to remember where she was and what lay across her body. Her arms tightened without moving. She did not startle, did not jerk. She turned her head just enough to see him, and he saw the recognition enter her gaze like a shadow moving across water. Color rose and receded from her face in a single tide. "Your Highness," she said. The words were air, placed precisely where they would do the least damage. Her voice had the rasp of someone who had rocked and sung for hours. She did not attempt to stand. One look at the twins' slack mouths told them both why. He kept his voice low. "Explain to me," he said. And even in those 3 words there was a fissure. The part of him that wanted obedience and the part that wanted comprehension had never liked each other. She swallowed. "They would not settle," she answered. "Nothing." She stopped, and he could hear her listening to her own tongue, selecting what could be said in a room where everything could be misheard. "I tried to put them down. Their bodies would not accept the linen." He stepped closer, then stopped where the light reached his shoes, and stopped again at the thought of the next step. The infants breathed in synchrony, 2 small chests rising beneath the shelter of her arms. The very sight argued against the order he had been prepared to give. "This is not permitted," he said. The sentence did not come out with the force he had intended. It sounded like a statement of weather. Her eyes, clear even in the low light, flicked to his, then down again. "I know," she said. "I could not find another way." He felt a curiosity he resented. "You have tried all the others." "Until I could not remember my own name," she said, and then, as if reminding herself that wit was a luxury offered to different rooms, she added, "Yes." In the corner, the clock marked the seconds with a sound like a small tamper striking once on earth. He let that sound measure his next breath. He could order her to rise. He could lift one child himself. He could call for another pair of hands to disentangle this impropriety into something recognizable. He imagined each action and watched each one in his mind wake the twins into wails. He had never felt so wrestled by the opposing shames at once. The shame of failing duty if he allowed this, the shame of failing compassion if he forbade it. "Do you understand what this looks like?" he asked. "Like sleep," she said. The answer was almost insolent. It was also true. She lowered her voice until he had to bend a fraction to catch the words. "Sir, they have cried every hour the night would hold. If you wish to punish me, I will not argue. But let them have this first." He had not been addressed like that in any room where his title mattered. He stared at the twin faces, at the damp crowns of hair pressed gently against her blouse. He thought of standing just outside this door night after night, listening, doing nothing but clench his teeth until his jaw ached, and count the ways people might judge a man for which door he chose to stand on either side of. "Who told you to do this?" His voice sharpened again, not for her, but for the ease with which his own sense of order was being undone. "No one," she said, and something in him recognized and disliked the echo of his own hard self-reliance in her tone. She was not pleading. She had done what needed doing, and now she stood inside the consequences of it without a shield. One of the twins stirred, a ripple across a pond. The child's mouth opened, head turning toward the faintest whisper of a sound. He and the maid froze together in an accord neither acknowledged. The child sighed instead of crying, breath hitching, then smoothing. The other followed the first's lead. The breaths resumed their soft paper sound. He could not ignore what his eyes and ears told him. He traced, without moving, the line of one tiny ear. He found himself wishing, with a longing that embarrassed him, to touch the small hand placed like a seal on the other child's shoulder. He kept his fingers a quarter-inch from the air. "What you have done is beyond your station," he said. The sentence was a form he had learned early. It felt dull and brittle in his mouth, an instrument he did not trust in a room that had learned its own music. "Yes," she said, "and if you ask me to leave them, I will put them back in their cradles. They will wake, they will cry. You may call someone more appropriate to stand where I am." The implied sentence was clean as cut glass. He was not immune to its edge. His jaw worked once. "I am not accustomed to being cornered by the truth." "Neither am I," she said. "I just prefer it to the sound they make when we try to ignore it." A kind of grim amusement flickered through him, immediately swallowed by caution. He glanced toward the door, which stood just ajar. The corridor beyond was a mouth that could inhale a story like this and carry it along every nerve. He could order it shut. He could not order it unsaid once it was witnessed. "Sit up," he said softer. "At least pull the coverlet." "If someone—" "I cannot move," she answered, and it was not defiance but calculation. "Look." He looked. The twins had drifted deeper into a sleep that made their limbs heavy. Any shift, even the small movement of her shoulder, would ripple through their bodies like thunder. He felt his own exhale lengthen. He did not like being taught by circumstance. He did not like that learning was precisely what he needed. He reached toward the coverlet himself and found the edge. He lifted it with careful hands, and for a moment there was only the sound of cloth against cloth. He spread it across to the infants' backs, his fingers a breath from her wrist. He felt the heat from her skin as if it were a second lamp. She did not flinch. He did not hurry. When the light blanket rested over them, the small bodies nestled deeper. They breathed together, and he felt the room come closer to him by a degree it had not dared for weeks. He was not sure whether to be grateful or to be afraid of the solace, which felt like a betrayal of something else he had sworn to guard. "You have put me in an impossible position," he said, voice low. "If I order you to rise, I will be heard calling cruelty a virtue. If I let you remain, I declare compassion at odds with rule." She did not try to comfort him. She did not have that right. She met his gaze instead. "I meant only to quiet them," she said. "If you decide I must be dismissed for it, say the word when they wake." He heard dismissal. He heard when they wake. The two halves of the sentence did not fit into an immediate action. He could have sized himself inside anger to avoid the choice, the easy armor of outrage that makes decisions simple. But anger broke apart in the face of the small hand shifting in sleep against the other's shoulder. "What is your name?" The question surprised him. It felt out of place, and yet, in this room where only necessity had any right, perhaps it had earned its place. She hesitated. "I am called what I am needed to be called," she said. It might have been a joke in another life. Here it held a kind of truth he recognized. He had been called many things in rooms he did not choose. He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. The lamp hummed. The clock tapped. The world had narrowed. He understood that any louder sound would tear it open. "You should never have done this," he said again, and the words no longer meant what they had meant a minute ago. "No," she said, "I should not have waited so long to do it." He blinked. A corner of his mouth wanted to move. He did not let it. He was not ready for what such a movement would permit. His gaze slid once more to the door. The narrow gap was a threat and a promise. He thought of crossing the room to close it and found himself held still by the knowledge that any shift in the air might wake the twins, and then this quiet would be a memory that no order could restore. He remained where he was, hand at his side, fingers curled and relaxed, the rhythm unwittingly matching the rise and fall of two small chests. A soft scrape passed along the corridor, a shoe on stone, weight distributed carefully to avoid sound. He felt the hair along his arms prick. The maid's eyes flicked to the door as well. He saw her measure the distance between scandal and need, and choose the latter again, not with bravado, but with the even readiness of someone willing to accept consequence for the sake of relief. He found himself almost whispering the order he had nearly spoken when he first entered. He swallowed it. The room held him inside the choice. After, he said, and did not finish the sentence. After they woke. After the night ended. After decision had to present itself in daylight. He left the rest unspooled between them, because to tie it off would be to jerk at a knot that had finally loosened. She inclined her head. After, she agreed, and the word felt like a plank laid across a dark gap. The scrape in the corridor came again, unmistakable now, the skid of a heel catching at a rush mat, the quick correction. A breath followed, not his, not hers, not the children's. He turned his head toward the sound with the reflex of a man trained to meet trouble with his face rather than his back. He wanted the door closed. He wanted the boundaries set by wood and latch, not by the thin will of his silence. He could not move to do it without risking the peace that sat like a bird on the edge of a branch. They waited. The air held every small thing. The lamp's whisper, the clock's tap, 2 steady breaths. The corridor breathed once more. The small iron latch of the nursery door shifted with the delicate certainty of a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. The door eased wider by the width of a palm, and in the widening, a shadow fell across the threshold and into the light. The shadow at the threshold belonged to the woman who kept the nursery's ledger and the household's patience, the senior governess. She stood a moment as if struck by a hush not measured by time. Then, with the quickness of someone who had learned to swallow scandal before it had teeth, she backed away into the corridor. Her skirts whispered against the stone as she retreated, a single, controlled motion that smoothed a tremor into an absence. From the hall, she did not speak. She did not need to. The look she cast over her shoulder was the sort that made servants shuttle and hands find tasks to occupy the mouth. She moved as if the sight had been a warning flare in a clean night sky. Her face, carved into formal propriety, held something else beneath. The calculation of a woman who understood the line between rumor and ruin, and how fast that line could harden into a verdict. Word spread the way water finds cracks. By morning, the household had a new current running through it, thin and sharp, like a thread pulled from a weave. Servants shifted in their duties with a careful choreography. The kitchen staff tilted words into lower bowls. Footmen angled their backs and averted their gaze. The senior maid who had shown the young attendant where to fetch water did not speak her usual jokes. Even the youngest scullion seemed to feel the change and ate his porridge in silence. The governess did not make declarations. She made herself visible. She took appointments to oversee feedings and appeared at the nursery door before the appointed hour. Her visits were not intrusive, but they were precise. Hands that hovered just out of reach, eyes that catalogued, lips that kept their measurements. She watched the new maid at work with a look that tested both steadiness and propriety. The maid noticed the difference at once. Where other eyes had been kind or distracted, the governess's gaze felt like a ledger being written. The nursery, always a place of small accommodations and whispered commands, tightened into a room of measured steps. The maids did not share jokes in the morning. The attendants stepped away when the new maid approached, pulling their tasks into corners as if proximity might stain them. She felt it like a chill against her skin. People step away when they want nothing to do with what they might be asked to defend. She continued her cares with the same quiet tenacity. She approached each routine as if it were the last, lining the infant's tiny garments with hands that moved without thought. When she lifted them, she did so as she had been taught, with respect for the weight and the danger of a slip. But it was the way she soothed them that men and women watched. Her fingers mapped out a rhythm that the children trusted. When they hiccuped, she hummed the same low tune and rocked in a pattern learned from a family no one in this palace knew about. There was something ancestral in the cadence. It seemed to fit the contours of their bodies like a hidden pulley. The governess protested with the soft severity of a woman who cared less for seasons of life than for the steadiness of a household. She suggested nursing schedules be altered, bedding changed, physicians consulted. She made lists in her mind of witnesses and dates, and kept them close as if preparing a dossier. She moved through the room as though arranging pieces on a board, each shift of a chair or a placid look at the twins, another move against a potential checkmate. The new maid felt that pressure slice through the air like knife light. Her hands never paused. She folded linens until the hem felt like ritual and soothed a cheek until it warmed with circulation. Yet children listened to the shape of caution. When someone else tried to take them, their cries rose as if to name the loss. Each time the governess stepped nearer than necessary, the infants' breaths thinned and tightened. The room learned their terror and returned it in kind. In the evening, the prince, who had seen this all from the outside of doors and tapestries, appeared once more at the edge of the nursery. He did not announce himself. He had found, unexpectedly, that the sight of the maid holding the children kept replaying in the theater of his mind as if it were a single scene painted in oils and hung where he could not turn away. He listened from the corridor, the way a man listens when he hopes not to be heard and knows he might be the one to be punished if he is. He watched the governess watch her. He watched the other servants dress their faces in small indifference. He observed the new maid's movements, the way she counted breaths and adjusted positions as if she could coax sleep from an obstinate wind. He felt something unnameable that was not mere curiosity. It was pity braided with an appreciation that made his chest an odd, heavy place. He had not expected tenderness to look so ordinary, nor to be so expensive in consequence. The governess approached him later with that careful, civil firmness that made each sentence land with the weight of a verdict. She spoke of order as if it were an instrument, and of rumors as if they were knives. He listened without interrupting, because interrupting in such matters would be to admit the thread was visible. He felt the words like chess pieces set upon a board, each one meaning to surround the problem until it could be taken. He excused himself into the night and returned to the threshold before anyone expected him. The children were quiet for a time, the lull of day folding into the lamp's circle. He lingered, feeling the tug of restraint and the pull of compassion like two opposing winds. He had a duty to uphold, a duty of blood and house and future, but he also had a private ledger, where each moment of warmth added an entry he could not overlook. He found himself standing between columns of obligation, unable to decide which was heavier. The maid did not speak of fear with words. She packed it into the way she moved through the day, into the quickened pulse behind her collarbones and the small measured breaths she took at the sight of an office door. Under the surface, however, there was a deeper determination. She had held the twins. She had seen what true rest looked like on their faces. The knowledge of it did not belong to a rank. It belonged to whoever would take the risk of being seen as less correct to make the children calm. She kept her head down as she worked. She answered questions with the economy of someone accustomed to being judged by actions rather than explanation. When the governess approached with lists and polite accusations, she offered only steady, factual replies. Her tone was not defiant. It was plain. "They settled when I held them," she said. And the words were both a report and a truth whose claim could not be softened by politeness. The governess made notes. Her hand moved on paper in a manner that suggested a mind composing a narrative. She left without making a scene, but one did not have to take the knife to wound when the air alone could bruise. The presence of that ledger was a threat in itself. It made the new maid feel counted. Night fell with the same quiet brutality as always. The palace darkened in stages, candles burned lower in salons, oil lamps were smothered, and servants took their evenings with conversations ceased. In the nursery, the lamp made private worlds under its shade. The maid readied for another vigil. She adjusted the tiny garments as if the act of folding them might keep time from shifting. The infant's cries rose again as darkness took its full shape. The sound of them was a thing that could cleave rooms in two, before this lasted and after. No medicant, no nurse's trick had found their mother's tones. They cried for what they had known and for what had been called away by grief, and they cried because bodies, even royal ones, are small and hungry for more than milk. The new maid breathed and took them both against a rhythm she had discovered in another life. She tried the warm cloth. She tried motion, the slow circle that matched the sway of rocking chairs. She hummed the same low, unnamed tune that had soothed their sleep not long before. Her feet made no sound on the rug. She moved as a woman who had measured her steps to keep a household's peace. The prince lingered outside the door, listening. He was not certain he should be there, not by law, nor by etiquette. But he had learned that some laws were thin when they met the fact of small bodies in pain. He had not come to witness impropriety. He had come to find out whether the sight of the maid with the children was a fluke or proof. He needed the evidence in a way that was far stranger than any ledger. A soft sound rose, not crying, but a tune threaded through the night air, delicate and low. The lullaby reached him before he entered, a small skein of sound that fit the contours of the room like a seam. It was not the kind of music learned in drawing rooms or in classrooms. It had the rough edges of a tune passed between mothers, and a weary tenderness that made a man feel, abruptly, the shape of his loss. He opened the door a fraction and stepped inside. The lamplight painted the room in gold. The maid stood in the center, rocking both infants in a slow, inward motion. Their heads rested on her chest and shoulder, a pair of small weights that had quieted under her warmth. The cradle in the corner waited empty and insulted. The air held the fragrance of warmed linen and the sweet, sharp scent of milk and sleep. For a moment he felt the entire world reduced to the small, steady motion of her arms, to the pattern of her breath matching theirs. He had come prepared to take charge, to restore order with a command. He had not come prepared to find a scene so fragile and so unarguably true that every outline of his duty blurred under its light. He stood, breath barely moving, and watched the children settle at last, their tiny hands slack, their mouths soft. He felt again the pull between what was permitted and what was kind, between the house's rules and a man's unseen hunger for a hush that signaled no more nights of unending cries. The governess's ledger lay in the corners of the room like a threat that had not yet been opened. The servants held themselves poised, waiting for the moment that might make a man choose a column. The prince remained in the doorway, unsure whether to close the gap between law and tenderness, when a movement in the hall made every head turn and the air constrict around the small scene like a hand. The sound of footsteps in the corridor thickened the air. They were slower than a servant's rush, measured and heavy, each one pressing the stone like a seal. The maid froze, the lullaby stilled on her lips. The prince's head turned toward the door, the angle sharp with recognition. He knew that tread. He had heard it since childhood. The rhythm belonged not to an attendant, but to authority itself. The knock came, firm, deliberate, not a request, not an intrusion, but a command. The brass handle shuddered with the weight of the hand that struck. A voice followed, clipped and formal, carrying the unmistakable cadence of palace protocol. His Highness is summoned. The Dowager requests him in her chambers. The nursery held its breath. The maid did not move, afraid the small stirrings of the children would unravel into noise again. The prince stood still for a heartbeat, torn between two rooms, this one and the one waiting behind his mother's door. Then he stepped forward, not toward her, not toward the infants, but toward the summons. His jaw locked. His words were low enough to be spoken only for the maid. Do not move them. Whatever you do, keep them quiet. She nodded once, eyes lowered, yet her arms tightened with the weight of both children. She knew what her obedience meant. She also knew what his instruction implied, that he trusted her more than the empty cradles, more than the protocols of the nursery. He left with long strides. The door closed behind him, leaving a corridor of silence where a moment ago duty had spoken. The maid bent her face to the children, whispering the rhythm of her breath back into their small bodies. Her voice was soft as smoke, but her heart thundered. The dowager's summons was never casual. The prince entered her chambers under a canopy of dark draperies and the scent of incense that masked the damp of stone. Candles glowed on a tall table where she sat upright, her figure rigid in mourning black. She did not rise. Her authority never needed motion. "Sit," she said, her voice iron pressed flat. He remained standing. "You have left your council for this?" he asked. She looked at him as if he had asked whether blood was red. "Rumors," she said with precision. "They do not wait until councils conclude. They move with the night, and they move about you." He knew what she meant before she named it. The nursery. "The maid," she corrected. The word held more weight than the child it should have referred to. "She has been seen with them in a manner no servant should dare, and you, my son, were seen permitting it." He held her gaze. "You have heard only half the story." "The half that matters," she answered. "Whispers are not concerned with nuance. They care for shape. The shape they see is a prince who allows his heir and spare to sleep in the arms of a maid." "They sleep," he said. The word struck the air like a challenge. For the first time in weeks, they sleep. His mother's eyes narrowed. At what cost to the dignity of this house? He exhaled, a sound between fury and grief. Dignity does not hush a child's cry. Dignity preserves the line that ensures those cries belong to children who will one day rule, she said. You think the household does not watch? You think ministers will not seize upon the first misstep to question your capacity? You are heir to more than their comfort. You are heir to a throne. He took a step closer to the table. And what use is a throne if it cannot protect what is already mine? The silence after the sentence stretched taut. The dowager's fingers tapped once against the arm of her chair. You speak as if you are the only one who is lost, she said, voice low. I buried my daughter-in-law too. I buried the chance of seeing her steady this house with the grace you lack. His face tightened. You buried her with my heart. The words escaped before he measured them, and once spoken, they rang with a truth he could not retract. For a moment, grief lay naked between them, a wound that looked the same in mother and son. Then the dowager veiled it again with authority. You will dismiss the maid, she said. You will restore order before gossip makes a scandal you cannot afford. He turned his head toward the window, where the night pressed against glass, unbothered by thrones or rumors. He wanted to deny her with a word. He wanted to defy her entirely. But the sound that rose in his memory, the quiet breathing of his children at last soothed, tied his tongue. In the nursery, the maid bent her body into patience. The governess lingered by the door, eyes sharp, recording every detail of impropriety. Yet the infants did not wake. Their fingers twitched once, then loosened again into rest. The maid hummed, a tune too quiet for anyone but them. The governess shifted her weight, disapproving yet hesitant to break what seemed miraculous. Her lips parted, then closed. She stepped back into the corridor, her silence a ledger entry. The maid knew it meant judgment would come, but for this moment, the children slept. The prince returned from his mother's chamber with his steps measured, the weight of her words pressed into his shoulders. He paused outside the nursery door, listening. Silence, broken only by the faint lull of song. His hand hovered on the latch, caught between command and surrender. He entered. The maid did not rise. She looked up at him with eyes that asked no favor, only braced for consequence. He did not speak. He only looked at the twins, asleep in her arms, as if the sight itself might justify everything. The air in the nursery thickened. For the first time, his hand twitched toward hers, a half motion to take one child. The gesture stalled between them, suspended like a bridge not yet built. Her breath hitched. The silence between them swelled, charged with something neither of them dared to name. And then, 3 hard knocks at the door, sharp as a gavel, cutting through the fragile hush like iron against glass. The sound of the knocks rang through the nursery, sharp and deliberate. The prince straightened, as though a blade had been pressed to his back. The maid tightened her arms around the twins instinctively, the soft weight of them grounding her even as her heart thudded against her ribs. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that stretched across the carved walls. A voice followed, low and firm, carrying no warmth. "His Highness is required at once." The prince drew a slow breath and crossed to the door. He opened it to find 2 attendants in the dowager's livery. Their expressions were composed, but their presence carried the unmistakable weight of his mother's authority. No explanations were given. None were necessary. He turned back into the room. His eyes found the maid. She had lowered her gaze, but not before he caught the flicker of fear there. His own jaw tightened. For an instant, he seemed poised to speak, to leave her with a command or a reassurance. Instead, he said nothing. He left the nursery in silence, the door closing with a soft click that felt like the shutting of a verdict. The governess, who had been waiting in the shadows of the corridor, stepped inside at once. She smoothed her skirts with unnecessary precision, her eyes cool as she surveyed the maid and the children in her arms. "You grow bold," she remarked. Her tone was not loud, but each word struck like a pebble cast into still water. "Take care that boldness does not carry you out of this house." The maid did not answer. She pressed her cheek lightly to the crown of one infant's head, breathing in the faint scent of milk and soap. She knew the governess was already measuring every gesture against a rulebook unwritten, but rigidly enforced. The governess lingered a moment longer, the silence between them more dangerous than words, before turning away. Meanwhile, the prince entered his mother's chamber once more. The dowager was seated, spine straight, mourning garb heavy as armor. The candles made the jewels at her throat gleam like small, cold stars. She gestured toward the chair opposite her. He remained standing. "You are careless," she said. "Your absence is noted. Your presence in the nursery is noted. And now the servants murmur as though the household itself is shifting beneath our feet." "They murmur because the children cry," he answered, "and because they are shocked into silence when at last the crying stops." "At the hands of a maid," the dowager replied, her voice like stone. "Do you not hear the danger in that? Whispers that the heirs are soothed by no one of their blood, only by a servant's embrace. It makes you look weak. It makes your house look vulnerable." His lips curved in a humorless smile. "And yet they slept. Does that look like weakness?" "Strength is not measured by lullabies," she retorted. "It is measured by order. You forget yourself. Grief has clouded your judgment." The words struck their mark. He turned his head, jaw tightening as he fought for composure. "Perhaps grief has sharpened it. Perhaps it has taught me to value silence in a nursery more than silence in a council chamber." Her eyes flashed. "You would risk scandal to defend a maid?" "I would risk scandal to defend my children's peace," he said. A silence fell, heavier than any argument. Then she leaned forward. "You will have an answer ready. A public dinner has been arranged. The court will attend. The children will be presented, and they must appear well. Your household will be watched. Do not imagine their eyes will miss the details." The words settled on him like a sentence. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement if not agreement, and turned on his heel. Back in the nursery, the maid laid the infants gently into their cradles. Miraculously, they did not stir. Their small mouths twitched in sleep, fists unclenching, as if at last willing to surrender. She straightened, pressing her palm to her chest to steady her own breath. The governess had left, but the threat of her scrutiny lingered in the walls themselves. The prince returned, his face unreadable, his step heavier than before. He paused at the sight of the cradles, the peace within them, like a fragile truce. His eyes flicked to the maid. She stood still, her hands clasped, her expression quiet, but taut with unspoken fear. "You will attend to them tomorrow," he said at last, his voice low. It was neither permission nor reassurance, but something in between. He turned away before she could answer. The next day dawned gray, the air damp with a mist that clung to the palace windows. Servants moved briskly in preparation for the dinner. Silver polished, candles trimmed, tablecloths shaken out to fall in perfect folds. In the nursery, the governess supervised every detail of the children's dress. Tiny coats buttoned, ribbons tied, curls smoothed. The maid stood near, ready with cloth and bottle, yet careful not to step beyond the governess's invisible line. When the hour came, the prince entered to escort his children. He looked at them in their fine clothes, restless and unsatisfied, already beginning to fuss. His gaze found the maid. For a moment his hand twitched, as if to beckon her forward. But under the governess's watchful eye, he restrained himself. The procession moved into the dining hall. The chandeliers blazed. Courtiers stood in glittering ranks, their expressions bright with anticipation and sharpened by judgment. The children were brought forth, one in each arm of a nursemaid. The prince followed, his presence commanding, though his eyes betrayed the strain of the moment. At first, the twins whimpered, faces screwed with discomfort. A ripple of unease moved through the gathering. Then, as if recalling some unseen comfort, they quieted just enough to be tolerable. Courtiers exchanged glances, murmurs rising like wind in a field. The dowager, seated in state, lifted her chin, daring anyone to voice suspicion. But one courtier did. He leaned forward, his voice carrying farther than he perhaps intended, though it rang clear in the sudden hush. "Remarkable," he said, lips curved in a smile too polished to be kind. "The little ones appear soothed tonight, though I cannot imagine it is by their father's hand." The words struck the hall like a spark in dry straw. Conversation stilled, heads turned. Eyes followed the trail of implication, and in their gaze lay the sharp edge of scandal. At the edge of the room, standing half hidden near the wall, the maid felt the weight of every eye shift toward her. The silence after the courtier's remark spread like spilled ink. The great hall, lined with crystal and gilded frames, seemed to hold its breath. The prince's shoulders stiffened, though his head turned only slightly, as if a full response would lend the words more power. The dowager's gaze cut across the table, sharp as a blade, silencing any further whisper. But the moment had already been born. Everyone present had heard it. Everyone present had seen where the courtier's eyes had fallen. The maid felt her throat close. She had kept to the edges of the room, back pressed near a column, the plainness of her dress a kind of shield. But plain cloth could not dim the suggestion that now tethered her to the children in every watching mind. She bowed her head, though heat rushed to her face, making her feel at once seen and vulnerable. The prince did not move. His voice, when it came, was low but precise. "If my children are calm, then Providence has granted it. Do not mistake their peace for entertainment." His words were measured, meant to cut the laughter from the remark without cutting the man himself. Still, a ripple of unease followed. The courtier bowed his head in apology, but the glance he cast at the maid as he straightened was not remorse. It was triumph. He had set the whisper loose. The meal continued, but the air had shifted. Servants moved with careful silence, aware of the new tension. The dowager remained impassive, though her hand tightened once on the arm of her chair. The prince spoke only when required, his replies clipped. Every so often, his eyes strayed toward the maid. He did not linger, but the fact of the glance was enough to feed the court's curiosity. By the time the dinner concluded, the maid had retreated deeper into shadow. She moved quickly when released, fleeing to the nursery with a swiftness that betrayed her need for walls that did not stare. There she removed the infants' coats and ribbons, laying them down gently, her hands shaking though she tried to still them. Her chest burned with shame, She had not spoken, had not sought notice, yet she had become the center of it. The prince entered not long after. He paused just inside the door, as though the threshold had grown heavier. She looked up once, then away, unable to meet his eyes. "You heard them," he said at last. His tone was even, but underneath lay a current of contained fury. "I heard," she replied quietly, smoothing a fold in one infant's blanket. "They mean to make you the story," he said. She swallowed hard. "Then I am finished here." The word startled him, though he did not let it show. He crossed closer to the cradles, his hand resting on the carved wood as though to ground himself. "Do you think I would allow it to end so quickly?" She lifted her gaze then, and their eyes met. "What else can be done? Their peace comes at too high a price." For a moment, the truth of her fear was so stark that he said nothing. The air between them thickened with all that could not be named. He had not chosen her. He had not permitted himself to. Yet the sight of her arms around his children haunted him more than any command of state. The next day, the whispers grew sharper. Servants bowed, but their eyes lingered. Conversation ceased when she entered a room. The governess moved with open suspicion, recording each of the maid's gestures with the precision of a scribe. And beneath it all, the children's restlessness grew. They cried when others held them, cried until their throats rasped, until the nursemaids shifted uneasily and glanced toward the governess for guidance. That evening, the maid found herself alone with the twins again. She gathered them, rocking them close, singing the low tune that had become her only defense against despair. Her arms ached, but she did not stop. She whispered their names, one after the other, as if speaking them into calm. Slowly, slowly, their cries softened, their breathing steadied. The prince appeared in the doorway, his figure half in shadow. He did not speak, but he watched. His face, carved with restraint, betrayed the smallest crack, the look of a man who wanted to step forward but could not. When at last the children slept, he exhaled and turned away. But she had heard enough earlier that day to know what was coming. 2 attendants had passed her in the corridor, speaking low, thinking her out of earshot. She had caught fragments. Removal. Inappropriate. Too close. She had walked on, her spine stiff, though the words had felt like stones in her stomach. Later, when she folded linen in the quiet nursery, her hand brushed a slip of paper tucked into the stack. She unfolded it carefully, her pulse quickening. The message was written in a practiced hand, unsigned. "Leave while you can, or all will be known." Her fingers trembled. She stared at the ink until it blurred. Someone wanted her gone. Someone knew enough of her past to make that demand credible. She pressed the paper flat against her palm, then folded it into her apron, her throat tight. At that moment, one of the infants stirred, letting out a small, distressed cry. She lifted him quickly, pressing him to her chest, her breath unsteady. She whispered against his hair, though the words were more for herself than for him. "I cannot lose you too." The door creaked softly. She turned her head to see the prince entering, his eyes searching her face. She froze, the paper burning like fire against her apron. "You are pale," he said, his voice low, unreadable. "I am tired," she answered, forcing steadiness into her tone. He studied her, as if he might read the truth in her silence. His hand brushed the cradle, then withdrew. For a long moment he seemed about to speak, about to name what had passed between them since that first night. Instead, he only said, "Keep them close tonight." She nodded. He left without another word. Only when the door shut did she let out the breath she had been holding. Her fingers clutched at the folded paper, hidden in her apron pocket, knowing it was not only her secret, but her undoing. The nursery fell silent again, except for the faint rustle of the curtains. The twins slept, their small bodies warm against hers. She sat motionless, the letter in her pocket, fear heavy in her chest, knowing that someone in this house wanted her gone. And in the stillness, She understood with piercing clarity that she could not keep both her secret and her place. A sudden knock on the nursery door shattered the fragile calm, making her rise with the child still in her arms. The knock echoed through the nursery like a gavel. The maid clutched the child tighter, his small cheek pressed against her collarbone, his breathing uneven from being startled awake. Her other hand hovered near the cradle, torn between soothing the infant in her arms and shielding the one still sleeping. The knock came again, sharper this time, followed by the scrape of a latch. The prince entered, closing the door behind him. His cloak was damp with the night air, his hair slightly disordered from haste. His eyes went first to the twins, then to her. He saw her standing rigid, her breath short, her gaze lowered but strained. Something in her posture made him pause. "They sent me word of raised voices," he said. "What has happened?" She shook her head quickly. Nothing. Only the children startled. He studied her. Her voice was too tight, her hands trembling as they cradled the infant. He stepped closer, lowering his tone. "Do not lie to me. You are pale." "What has been said?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated. The letter in her pocket felt heavier than the child in her arms. She could not tell him all of it, what it threatened, what it risked. Her secret was not only her own. To reveal it now would be to shatter what little place she had carved here. But the silence pressed against her throat like a hand. At last she whispered, "They want me gone." His jaw tightened. "Who?" "I do not know." "It is enough that they wish it," she said, her eyes fixed on the child's small hand curled into her gown. "And enough that they will have it." He took another step closer. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, the dark shadows beneath his eyes. "You believe you can simply leave, and all will be well?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Do you believe I can stay?" The air between them thickened. For a long moment, neither spoke. The child in her arms shifted, sighing softly, and the fragile sound made both of them soften for a heartbeat before the tension returned. His voice, when it came, was quieter. "Tell me why you endure this." Her throat worked. She looked down at the infant. "Because I have known children who cried until they never cried again. Because I could not save them. And I will not watch that happen here." The confession hung between them, raw and incomplete. He knew she had given him only part of the truth, but it was enough to strike at something inside him. His voice lost its edge. "You speak as if the whole weight of their survival rests in your hands." She looked back at him, eyes burning. "Does it not?" He had no answer. His silence admitted more than words could. For a moment, the room was only the sound of the child's breath and the clock's slow marking of time. Then, as if compelled by something stronger than caution, he reached out and brushed the back of his hand lightly against the child's head. His fingers hovered near hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. She stilled, her breath catching, though she did not pull away. "You should not be the one to bear this burden," he said. "Then take it from me," she murmured. The words startled him. His hand withdrew as though burned. His face tightened with conflict, the kind that left no easy path. He looked at her, at the quiet determination etched into her features, and felt both admiration and fear. Before he could reply, a knock rattled the door again. This time it was not measured, but decisive. The governess's voice followed, cold and formal. "His Highness will hear the Dowager's decision. The new governess has been appointed." The maid froze. The infant in her arms whimpered, sensing her change of breath. Her eyes darted to the prince, wide with dread. He did not speak. He only stood rigid, his face a mask of fury carefully contained, as the words settled in the nursery like a noose tightening around her throat. The handle turned, the door beginning to open. The door opened with the finality of judgment. The governess entered, flanked by 2 attendants bearing folded garments and a ledger. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though each one declared possession of the nursery. She curtsied to the prince, but her gaze was already fixed on the maid. "The dowager has appointed me to full charge of the heirs," she announced. "By her order, the maid is to be relieved of duty. At once." The maid tightened her hold on the infant in her arms. For a moment she could not move, could not breathe. Her body swayed gently, rocking without thought, even as her throat burned with the knowledge that this was her dismissal. The child stirred but did not cry. His small head burrowed deeper against her. The other infant shifted in the cradle, sensing unrest in the air. The prince's jaw clenched, his eyes cut to the governess. "I was not consulted." "The dowager requires no consultation," she replied smoothly. "Her decision is for the good of the house. The rumors cannot continue. The maid will be escorted to gather her things." The maid's lips parted, but no sound came. She lowered her eyes quickly, hiding the tears that pressed hot against her lashes. She adjusted the child one last time, pressing a kiss so light to his hair that it might have been mistaken for a breath. Then, with deliberate care, she placed him in the cradle. His hands clenched, his mouth quivered, and his body stiffened with the beginnings of a cry. The prince stepped forward, but the governess raised a hand as though directing a performance. "The children must learn discipline. They will sleep without coddling. Better for them now than later." The maid's hands lingered above the cradle. Her lips trembled, though she forced them still. She bowed her head, curtsied to the prince, and whispered, "Forgive me." His breath caught, but he did not answer. He watched her retreat to the corner, where her small bundle of belongings lay already prepared, as though some part of her had known this moment was inevitable. She lifted it with shaking fingers, the weight far lighter than what pressed against her chest. The governess turned to the attendants. "See her out." The maid moved through the doorway as if walking into a void. Behind her, the first child cried in earnest, his voice cutting through the chamber. The second followed, their twin cries rising with desperate force. The governess stiffened, motioned for the nursemaids to take over, and ordered the door shut. The prince stood still, his fists tight at his sides, while the cries behind him swelled like a storm trapped in walls. He heard the governess ordering calm, ordering patience, but the wails did not cease. They rose higher, shrill and aching, until they echoed down the corridor, filling every silent space with need. He turned sharply, leaving the nursery. His steps carried him through the hallways, each cry following as if tethered to his chest. He entered the council chamber, where his ministers sat waiting. Papers rustled, voices hushed, and the conversation pressed forward. Alliances, treaties, the expectation of his remarriage. The words struck him like stones, but over all of them came the sound, faint, muffled by distance, yet insistent. His children, crying still. He tried to listen. He tried to answer. He sat rigid in the high-backed chair, but his mind remained fixed on the nursery. A minister spoke of foreign proposals, another of strengthening ties. He nodded once, twice, but then the sound carried again, not imagination, but truth, the cries bleeding into the chamber through the ancient stone. The men shifted uneasily, pretending not to hear. The prince's hands curled against the arms of his chair. His lips pressed into a thin line. The words at the table became meaningless. Syllables drowned beneath the echo of what he could no longer ignore. At last he rose, cutting across a minister's sentence. His chair scraped the stone. "The council is adjourned." The chamber stilled. Protests stirred on the lips of his advisers, but none dared speak them. He strode from the room, cloak sweeping behind him, his face set with a resolve that admitted no interruption. The corridors fell silent as he passed, except for the sound that grew louder with each step, the wailing of two infants left inconsolable. He reached the nursery. The door stood open. The governess bent over the cradles, her voice sharp with instruction. Nursemaids hovered helplessly, rocking, patting, trying every approved method. But the children thrashed, their cries hoarse with refusal. The prince stood in the doorway, taking in the chaos. His jaw hardened, his breath sharp. His eyes scanned the room once, searching for the figure who should have been there, the one who could have quieted them with a single touch. But she was gone. His chest constricted with fury, grief, and something far more dangerous, the sudden, piercing certainty of loss. He crossed the threshold in 3 long strides. The governess turned, startled, but before she could speak, he lifted a hand, silencing her. The twins cried harder, their bodies stiff with desperation. He stood by the cradle looking down at them, his face caught between helplessness and decision. His hand hovered above the small fists, trembling with the force of what he knew and what he had tried to deny. He whispered once, not to the children, not to the governess, but to himself. Enough. And then, with emotion sharp and unyielding, he turned from the cradle and strode out of the nursery. His steps were swift, purposeful, carrying him through the halls with the sound of the infant's cries chasing after him. Louder, louder, until they filled the air like an anthem. He did not stop until he reached the lower corridors where the air was colder and the stones smelled faintly of damp. At the far end, he saw her, the maid, her bundle clutched to her chest, her face pale, her body turned toward the servants' entrance. He called her name, and the word broke like thunder in the silence. She froze where she stood. She froze in the shadowed corridor, her bundle clutched to her chest. The stone beneath her feet was cold, the kind of cold that seeped through shoes and into bone. The servants' entrance stood only a few paces away, its iron latch catching the faint glimmer of torchlight. Freedom, or exile, was a single step beyond it. His voice had stopped her. He stood at the far end of the hall, the air behind him still carrying the distant wail of the infants. The echoes twisted through the stones, pulling them both back toward the nursery, even as they faced each other in this darker passage. "Do not go," he said, his voice rough with command, but layered beneath with something he could not disguise. She turned slowly, her arms tightening around the bundle as if it might shield her. Her eyes met his only for an instant before lowering. "It is already decided," she whispered. "Your mother has seen to that. The governess has taken her place. I have none left." He strode forward, each step echoing sharply. When he stopped before her, he was close enough that the faint scent of damp stone mingled with the warmth of his presence. He looked at her bundle, then at her face, searching it. "If you go, they will not quiet," he said. "You know it as well as I do." Her lips trembled. "That is precisely why I must. Their peace cannot depend upon me. It will destroy us both." He drew in a breath, as though steadying himself against the words he meant to speak. "You think I fear ruin? I fear the sound I just heard, the cries that split the air like knives. I sat in council while they echoed through walls, while men spoke of treaties as if their voices were louder than my own children. And all the while I knew who they needed." Her eyes flickered, caught between disbelief and something more fragile. "You will shame yourself to defend me." "I will shame myself if I let them suffer for the sake of appearances," he said. His voice softened, though its force did not. "And I will shame myself if I let you walk out of these doors as if you were nothing to them, or to me." The corridor seemed to tighten around them. The torches hissed in their brackets, the sound like breath drawn between clenched teeth. She lowered her bundle slowly, her fingers trembling against the cloth. "You speak as if I matter beyond my station." He leaned closer, his face taut with restraint. "Do you believe I have not seen? From the first moment I found them asleep against you, I have not been able to forget it. You gave them what I could not. You gave me what I thought was lost with her." The words broke something in her. Her eyes filled, though she blinked them clear. She could not move, could not answer, for fear her voice would betray too much. Instead, she whispered the truth she had withheld. "I lost children once. They died before I could comfort them. That is why I could not leave yours to cry. I could not watch history repeat itself." The confession hung heavy between them. He felt it sink into him like stone into water. For the first time he understood the depth of her quiet persistence, the wound beneath her strength. He reached for her bundle and lowered it gently to the floor, his hand brushing hers with a deliberate care that carried more meaning than any word. "You should have told me," he said. She shook her head, voice breaking. "It is not a story I wish the palace to know." "It is a story I needed to know," he replied. Then softer, "And it changes nothing, except that it binds us further." For a long moment they stood in silence, the cries from above fading into the distance. In that hush, the world narrowed to the breath they shared, to the fragile space that neither of them crossed, though both longed to. At last he said, "You will not leave. Not while I have the power to keep you." Her lips parted, protest rising, but he lifted a hand. "I do not mean as a servant. I mean as one who has proven herself essential to this family. I will face what comes of it. Let them whisper. Let them question. I will not see my children suffer because the court prefers rules over mercy." Her heart twisted with equal parts hope and fear. She pressed a hand to her chest as if to steady it. "They will not forgive you for it." "Then I will not ask their forgiveness," he said. "I will choose peace in the nursery over peace at the table." For the first time, she let her shoulders ease. A tremor passed through her, relief and terror tangled together. She lowered her head, unable to hide the tears that finally spilled. His hand lifted, hesitated, then touched her arm with the lightest pressure, a promise of steadiness. Neither spoke further. He bent, lifted her bundle, and placed it back into her hands. But this time, instead of guiding her toward the door, he turned her back toward the stair. Together, they ascended, his stride steady, hers trembling but certain. When they reached the nursery, the cries still filled the room. The governess looked up sharply, startled to see them both return. Her lips parted in protest, but the prince silenced her with a single look. He gestured toward the maid. "Give them to her." The governess stiffened. "Your Highness." "Now," he said. The word rang like steel. Reluctantly, the nursemaids surrendered the infants. Their small bodies were stiff with distress, their faces blotched from tears. The maid gathered them both, whispering as she drew them close. Within moments, their cries softened to hiccups, then to breaths. The hush returned as if it had never been broken. The room exhaled. Even the governess seemed momentarily stripped of argument. The prince stood watching, his expression unguarded at last. What had been suspicion, gossip, and scandal was now undeniable truth. The children needed her, and so did he. He stepped nearer, his hand brushing the cradle before resting at the edge of her sleeve. His voice was low, meant only for her. "Let this be the end of their cries, and the beginning of something we will guard together." The children slept against her, their warmth seeping through her gown, their breath soft as peace itself. For the first time in many nights, the nursery held stillness unmarred by grief. The maid lifted her eyes to him. There were no more words between them, only a shared recognition that the cost of this choice would be heavy, but it had been made. And as the lamp burned low, the prince stood beside her, watching over the twins, no longer divided by duty and fear, but bound at last by a truth neither could deny. Lamplight softened the hard edges of the room, and the hush that followed felt new and breakable. The twins breathed in paired rhythm against her arms, the weight of them anchoring her to the cot. The governess stood like an accusation beside the cradles, lips pressed thin, ledger clutched to her chest. Two nursemaids hovered with useless hands, their eyes caught between obedience and relief. The prince did not move from the maid's side. "Your Highness," the governess began, voice even, "this is not in keeping." He looked at her, only that, and the rest of the sentence withered. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You will leave us." A flush climbed the governess's neck. "The dowager will be informed," he said. "By me, you will leave us now." Silence collected in the corners like dust. The governess bowed, the gesture tight, and signaled the nursemaids. They withdrew reluctantly, backs to the wall, slipping through the door with the wary steps of soldiers leaving a field before the final order. The latch settled. Only then did the room breathe again. The maid did not speak. Her throat had closed on words when the children quieted. She could only listen to their breaths and to the faint tremor inside her chest answering them. The prince reached for the coverlet and drew it a fraction higher over the small backs. His hand brushed her sleeve, and a pulse leapt through her like heat striking frost. He kept his gaze steady. No one will remove you again. Not while they need you. Not while I do. The lamp hummed. Shadows wavered and settled. She found her voice's edge. You set yourself against your house. I set myself between them and what hurts them, he answered. That is the first duty of a father. I will not barter it for decorum. The words landed in her like a stone finds water, sinking and sending ripples through everything. She had expected to be told to leave again in a softer voice. She had not expected a kind of vow. You have made enemies, she said quietly. I have clarified what matters, he said. A corner of his mouth threatened to move. He caught it back. Let them write their lists. I will write my own ledger. He stood for a breath longer, looking down at the small faces that had finally unclenched. The room carried the scent of warm linen, milk, and the faint tang of brass from the lamp's key. The cot creaked as the maid shifted the smallest degree to spare her arm. He noticed, and the wordless part of him reached for a solution. Rest a moment, he said under his breath. I'll take one. She hesitated, terror pricking at the quiet. If they wake, then we will begin again, he said, and he held out his arms. The gesture was careful, not a command, but an offering. She studied his hands, the way his fingers softened, ready to cradle rather than control. She measured his breath, slow and even. Then, with the minute choreography of someone diffusing powder, she transferred the child whose breath was steadier. For a heartbeat, the infant stirred, one fist uncurling like a pale leaf. The prince settled him against his chest, his own shoulders easing. A murmur, low and steady, rose from his throat without plan or pride. It was not a song. It was simply breath, shaped into reassurance. The maid watched, surprised into stillness. The sight reached her with a sweetness that hurt. His face, so often set like stone, softened along the brow, along the hard line of the jaw. He bent his head enough to bring his cheek near the soft down of the child's hair. The small form calmed, as if recognizing a map it had been meant to carry. You see, he said, not looking up, voice roughened by tenderness. There is more than one way to be necessary. She let the truth rest in the space between them. There is also more than one way to be brave. He did not answer, not with words. His hand, supporting the small back, trembled once and steadied. The lamp's flame burned a shade higher, and the shadows crept back from their faces. Long moments passed, measured by the clock's patient tick, by the infant's weight against his chest, by the pulse settling under the maid's skin. A faint sound came from the corridor. Steps, a rustle of skirts, a breath held and let out. The latch trembled, as if tested by a hand that remembered authority. The prince lifted his head, the motion quiet but unambiguous. We are not to be disturbed. The steps retreated. The room held. He glanced toward the maid's bundle near the door, the folded life that had nearly left the palace. He moved closer, not to speak about it, not yet, but to stand where she sat, to make a single piece of shelter with his body and the wall. She eased the second child higher and felt the knot of fear under her sternum loosen by a notch. You told me a piece of your past, he said after a time, the words careful. I cannot return what was taken from you, but I can refuse to add to it. You refuse much tonight, she said. It could have been a rebuke. It sounded instead like a benediction. His eyes met hers then, and something passed between them that belonged to neither rank nor role. It was recognition of grief, of stubbornness, of the particular courage that persists without audience. It left them both more exposed and less alone. "If you wish to send me away when they sleep," she added, though the thought scraped her throat raw, "I will go without argument. But I will not go while they sound like that." "I will not ask you to go at dawn or at dusk," he said. The quiet around his words was not emptiness. It was promise. "You will remain." He did not elaborate, and she did not demand terms. The nursery had no appetite for contracts, only for acts. The one he had offered already was enough to change the air. The infant in his arms stirred, eyelids fluttering, mouth opening with a small sound. He swayed, once, twice, and the sound dissolved back into breath. She couldn't help it. She smiled. A quick, unbelieving curve. He saw it as if the room had brightened. "It suits you," he said. "What does?" "Peace," he replied, and looked back at the child so she could pretend not to hear what else he had meant. Dawn laid a thin seam of pale light along the edge of the curtains. The lamp dipped and steadied. The night's hardness began to slough away. In the hush, a bell far off marked the hour softly, as if afraid to wake anyone. Footsteps approached again, slower, respectful, stopping short of the door. A voice, one of the attendants, spoke barely above a breath. "Your Highness, the household asks for instruction." He did not turn. "Tell them, the maid remains with the heirs. The governess is relieved of charge. Any protest will be brought to me." A pause, disbelief swallowed into obedience. "Yes, Your Highness." "And," he added, softer but unarguable, "no more talk." The footfalls withdrew. The maid's breath wavered. "They will not like it." "Perhaps the house has been ruled long enough by what it likes," he said. "Let it be ruled for a time by what is needed." The words were not thunder. They did not shake walls or carry down stairwells. Yet the room felt altered by them, rehung on surer nails. At last, when the children's sleep was heavy and untroubled, he lowered the one in his arms to the cradle. He did it with the same care she had used, inch by inch, letting wood accept weight before the body did. The child did not wake. He stood, as if astonished by his own success, and reached to help her rise. "No," she murmured, looking down. "I am content to be still." "So am I," he said. They stood like that, one seated, one standing, joined by the shared watch. The lamp's wick needed tending. He turned it down a fraction and set the shade to throw gentler light. Their shadows touched the ceiling and, overlapping, made a single shape. He cleared his throat, the formality of habit before a risk. "The court will demand an explanation." "Then give them one," she said. "A true one." His mouth lifted, barely. "I intend to." He looked at the cradles, then back. "But I will not begin on their terms." "How will you begin?" "By remaining here," he said. "With you." The answer was simple. It felt radical. She nodded once, more breath than motion. Her eyes prickled. She looked at his hand, at the callus where a pen had long rubbed his finger, at the faint scar by the thumb she had not noticed before. Then she lifted her own hand, not quite touching, and stopped, a finger's breadth away. The space between skin and skin felt charged with a tenderness that tightened her throat. "You may," he said, the permission shaped not by rank, but by trust. She laid her hand on his. Warmth climbed her arm. He did not clasp, only placed his other hand above lightly, making of their fingers a small bridge over the edge of the cot. The gesture did not claim. It affirmed. They remained so until the light along the curtains widened and the nursery shifted to day. Soft steps returned. The older maid, the attendant who had brought water on that first night, both pausing in the doorway at the sight within. Their faces changed, not with shock, but with something like relief. The older maid bowed her head and withdrew without a word. He exhaled, as if permission had been granted from quarters that mattered more than state. "What will you tell your mother?" she asked. "The truth," he said, "that her grandchildren sleep." He paused. "And that I now choose what keeps them sleeping." She let out a sound that was almost a laugh, quiet and disbelieving. "You cannot put that on a notice." "I can put it in a life," he said. He released her hand then, not abruptly, but as one ends a sentence that does not need repeating. He drew the curtains a shade wider, let clean, pale light paint the tops of the cradles. The twins, oblivious to decrees and defiance, slept on, their hands slack, their mouths content. The room tasted different, less of fear, more of breath. A thought had pressed at her since the corridor, and now it found its words. "You said I mattered beyond my station." "I did," he said. "You do not need to say more," she added quickly, color rising. "It is enough that you said it at all." He stepped closer, the distance a choice rather than a constraint. "I will say more, whether I need to or not." He searched her face and found no refusal there, only the braced courage of a woman who had carried too much alone. His own voice turned unsteady for the first time. "You have given them peace. You have given me a way back to them, and to myself. If there is a place for you that is not the shadows, I will make it." Her breath caught. Hope hurt. She felt it anyway. "I will not ask." "You do not have to," he said. He did not touch her face. He did not pull her into his arms. He allowed the restraint to carry the meaning. It deepened what they had already chosen. He laid his palm flat on the edge of the cot, close enough that her fingers could find it again if she wished. They did. The day brightened. Somewhere below, the house resumed its clatter. Somewhere above, a bell chimed. None of it entered the nursery. The world's noise pressed its ear to the door and found itself refused. The prince lowered his head toward the children in a wordless salute, then looked at the maid as if concluding a pact. "We keep watch," he said. "We keep watch," she echoed. Sunlight settled on the twins' faces like a promise. The lamp, at last unnecessary, guttered and went out. The room belonged to breath, to warm light, to a peace earned without permission and held without apology. And together, hand over hand above the cradle, they began the life they had chosen to guard. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.